Well, this morning we're going to start things off with West Virginia Secretary of State Mac Warner. He's making his way through the Eastern Panhandle. Good morning, Mr. Secretary. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Hey, thanks for having me on. It's great to be here.
And also in studio, we've got Dave Tackett, who is your Chief Information Officer. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Might I say, I like your suit and tie. That's very handsome. We were joking before about traveling and taking dress clothes with us, and of course you wear it, and here we are on the radio. Terrific, where no one can see. So
can see.
I'm going to make it worth your while. And of course, welcoming back Darrell Shull. Darrell, great to have you on.
Good morning, Hans.
Eastern Panhandle field representative for the Secretary of State. And Mr. Warner, you and I got a chance to talk a few months back at Hollywood Casino. You were there speaking, I think it was to the Jefferson County Chamber of Commerce and some other folks who'd gathered. And since that time, I see you pop up in the news. I know you're in Washington, D.C. doing this or Canadian Valley doing that, and we're going to hit on some of it. But I haven't seen you here as much because of those sorts of activities, but I still feel like your office has been very present. Darrell's had a lot to do with that, I think. But is that intentional, trying to get more of a presence in other parts of the state rather than just Charleston?
It is. When we came into office, I got rid of some of the people around me, so we didn't want to make it a Charleston-centric office. Instead, we developed a field rep team, and so we sent those resources out into the field, and Darrell is the one here in the Eastern Panhandle. We have the state broken into 5 different regions and a field rep in each one of those. And we just finished this training that you mentioned at Canadian Valley. It's required by the legislature to train the clerks throughout the state. And so these field reps are well received by the clerks throughout the state. That was the resounding message I received from the clerks, is that they all enjoy having these field reps show up in their office where they can explain situations to them in person and then have them bring those issues back to us in Charleston for resolution. And then we send the message back out. So if we have an issue here in the Eastern Panhandle, it's likely that the clerks throughout the rest of the state are having it. Darrell will help solve it, and then we get that message out through the field reps to the rest of the county clerks.
And it's, again, you don't have to be 55 counties at one time, but the work can still get done.
Right. I can't be there. But literally just the week before, there was an issue that rose in Harrison County, and within an hour, our field rep was in that county clerk's office talking and discussing the situation with her. And we brought resolution to it. And I couldn't be from Charleston to Harrison County, in an hour. So that's kind of responsiveness that the field or the county clerks like.
Well, I would think that makes their job much easier, gives them the opportunity to interact with your office. It also helps, though, from the other aspect of your job, which is the not-for-profit and the business interaction. Darrell's got a couple of hats along with his fellow field representatives, and he's going to soon have a desk, too, a permanent office.
As well as co-workers. We'll be staffing 2 business licensing specialists in that office to help business startups and renewals.
And that goes along with the theme of bringing our office to the people rather than trying to make people come from the Panhandle to Charleston. We realize that's a long drive. Let's open up the office here in Martinsburg, where the Panhandle is growing, and make it easy for people to come in and deal with a person and have their issues resolved at a field office. So we're calling it a business hub here in Martinsburg.
We look around anecdotally at the houses going up. We see the traffic picking up, and we complain about it a bit, but it's a good problem to have. Our population is growing. We see those numbers year after year. Is it the same in the business community? Are you seeing business registrations in the Eastern Panhandle indicating that same growth?
Absolutely. And we wish the rest of the state had the issues that you all have, and they wish that they had the issues that you have.
Right. Hoppy Kercheval said that to me once. He said, yeah, but they'll take your traffic and everything else over 10% unemployment.
And we see it not just in Jefferson and Berkeley counties. Last month, Morgan County saw its fastest business growth in several years.
That's exciting news.
It is.
Well, we're speaking this morning with Secretary of State Mac Warner, also in studio CIO Dave Tackett, and CIO is Chief Information Officer. I always like to spell that out. And his Eastern Panhandle Field Representative, Darrell Shull. So you mentioned this training. You're in Canadian Valley. You had what looked like great participation to the numbers I saw, 156 clerks as well as their staffs, all 55 counties represented. Is that what you hope for with these types of events?
Yes, I was very pleased. We had over 40 clerks themselves, and then the clerks that couldn't make it sent it was an elections officials training, so they sent their elections officials. But yes, all 55 counties were represented, and just a great conference.
We lost Bonnie Woodfall, who retired here in Berkeley County. I know that's That's decades of experience.
Lots of institutional knowledge. Yeah.
Is it? It's not quite the same without Bonnie, I guess. It's been
Absolutely not.
well, but the training must go on. I'm sure that she has somewhat. She taught people before she left what they needed to do. John Small, of course, carrying a lot of experience himself with Berkeley County here. So in good hands, and certainly after this training, up to date on the latest regulations, any law changes, and some of your priorities as Secretary of State. Can you talk about what went on in Canadian Valley over this process in terms of what you focused on and what these elections officials left with?
Sure. As you mentioned, any new laws and regulations, such as moving the distance from which you can campaign around a polling place from 300 feet to 100 feet, those are the type of technical issues that were discussed. But elections training, this special bond election that we have coming up in less than a month now, early voting starts next week, in fact. It's going to be done with a paper ballot, and a lot of these clerks haven't used paper ballots for a while. So we had to go through the actual routine that you have to go through to have a paper ballot election. We have 15 new clerks out of our 55 counties. 15 are new this year, either elected, 13 elected, and then due to either a death and that sort of thing. So the benefit of a training where you bring people together, these are new clerks who are getting in the same room, the same training with people who have had experience for 20, 30, 40 years. And that kind of training, they can meet, discuss issues, and also the clerks. At one point, we kind of broke them out and had somewhat of the new clerks in one session and the more seasoned clerks in another, so that we weren't going through the basics with those people who had been through it for 15, 20 years. But the new clerks felt free to ask what, somebody might think, well, that's an easy question, but for a new clerk, everything's new. I can tell you as a new Secretary of State,
there's a learning curve.
There is.
Back to paper ballots. I mean, is it just cheaper than rolling out the machines and unpacking them and going through that process?
It is. We are giving the counties a chance or the choice. If they want to use the machines, they can, but typically there's more of an expense associated with that. So what the governor is doing is reimbursing the counties up to the cost of the paper ballots. And then if they want to spend more and use their electronic machines, they can. But they pay for it.
That's their prerogative. As long as we can, and I'm sure. Well, no, I'm not sure. I'll ask just because it pops into my head. Hanging chads. I mean, we haven't dealt with paper ballots here in Berkeley County for quite a while, but do you have to review that sort of thing to say, remember, double check and have them poke all the way through? Well,
there's not a poke on this. This is fill in the blank or, check, that sort of thing. And they went through that, had the X or the check and that sort of thing. And that's what the poll workers, they need to train the poll workers, and the poll workers explain to people how to properly fill in the ballot.
West Virginia Secretary of State Mac Warner speaking with us this morning. Were you able to go over the ongoing efforts to remove outdated, deceased, and ineligible voters from the files?
Well, they are very familiar with that process. The clerks do this work. What we do is we give them the tools. We are working with the Electronic Registration Information Center, the Interstate Cross-Check System, and those systems have names that pop up and say, look at this, perhaps deceased, perhaps convicted felon, double voting, double registration, and we then pass those names along to the clerks, and then the clerks are the ones responsible for their individual counties to review that. Part of that process is a postcard, sending a postcard to validate an address and that sort of thing, and that has just occurred. Now, we had already started that process before the governor announced the date for the special election. It just so happened these two things coincided with one another, in addition to the training that we just mentioned. So the legislature requires this training every other year in the off-year election, because that's when it should be quieter for the clerks. Well, in our situation, they got the triple whammy, all right? The special election, this postcard business, and then this biannual training. So our clerks have been very busy, but we had a very positive training, and they get it. They understand the need for cleaning up these rolls. They're taking on, I haven't had any pushback from any clerk anywhere in the state about us trying to clean up the rolls. So I have some very willing participants in this process. They've been doing a wonderful job. We're going to get this election pulled off, and but they are very busy.
Well, we're in the middle of voter registration month. Monday, the 18th, is the deadline to register to vote in this special election, correct? That's not the primary in May. That's just for this election. And as you mentioned, early voting starts next week. So, come back from training and hit the ground running, because here we go. The postcards are going out at the same time with this registration. will it be clear to those who receive them that this is not about your registration or your ability to vote? These will be clearly separate mailings from the Secretary of State's office?
That's correct. And if it's not clear, we're encouraging people to talk with their county clerk, and the county clerk's going to explain that situation.
When you start to look at this age of misinformation, fake news, whatever you want to call it, people like to jump to conclusions. There's been thousands and thousands of people removed from the voter rolls. All of those bad, names on the ballot, or on the rolls, is not the same thing as an illegal vote. So I just want to clarify that. We're not talking about illegal voting going on. We're talking about making sure that everything is appropriate and legal.
Well, yes, and these aren't people; these are names.
Names, right? Okay.
They're on the list, and people, someone who has died, a convicted felon who shouldn't have been on there in the first place, somebody who's registered in 2 counties or 2 states. That's what's being cleaned up. And the reason for that is, there are a number of reasons, but the first is it removes that opportunity for an irregularity to occur, someone to vote an absentee ballot in their name, for example. And we did have a mayor who was removed from office just a year ago in West Virginia for that very thing. So where did he get those names to vote that absentee ballot? Off of a list, okay? So you remove those opportunities for fraud to occur. But it also, think of this, it reduces the costs in the election. You don't have to print as many ballots. For a candidate, they're not sending out literature or spending money to try to reach these people who don't exist or who shouldn't be on the list to begin with. You don't have to, like I said, don't have to print as many ballots, so it's going to save the county's money. So they're just, nothing but good can come out of cleaning up a voter registration list.
At the very least, it's more efficient. And again, as you say, when these irregularities pop up, that's a red flag for your office, for your county clerk to swing into action. And if it turns out to be completely innocent, to say, oh, this person was deceased, or oh, this person moved and didn't update, so they came back to vote. It's not, an act of intentional voter fraud necessarily, but it is, all of a sudden you've got a time-consuming investigation going on as you're trying to count up ballots and get legitimate results out.
Exactly. And speaking of results, one thing everybody looks at is the voter turnout. Well, we've already taken off 6% of the total number of people registered in West Virginia during the cleanup since I've been in office. With this postcard that has gone out, when we finish this process, but I would say by the end of the year, I predict up to 10% of the people will have been made inactive or have come off this list. So think about that. Just if you have the same number of people voting next election as we did last election, you're going to have an increased turnout simply because you've reduced that number of people off the registration list.
West Virginia Secretary of State Mac Warner in studio with us this morning, along with Dave Tackett and Darrell Shull. Our state does have a checkered past when it comes to election integrity, not in recent years necessarily, but throughout our history. Laws have changed, though. Technology's changed and closed some of those gaps, but still there are concerns. Has there been any evidence at this point of illegal voting that you're able to share with listeners?
There has been. In fact, we've already had one case that's been closed, convicted, and he confessed and so forth. And I can tell you we're actively pursuing situations that we'll see where that information goes. But yes, there are situations.
And again, the confession, finding it and following through with the conviction and then correcting it is the point. That's how the system's supposed to work. There are going to be bad actors. Ideally, you can prevent these things from happening entirely. If something slips through, though, it's good to know that the net is working.
Well, and what I put out to the clerks is an ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure. I don't want to have to deal with this after the election. I would much rather put the word out ahead of time, and that's why I appreciate these opportunities to talk with you and your listening audience. Know that if you witness an irregularity, if you have a concern, and you want to file a complaint, there's a complaint procedure. Go to the West Virginia Secretary of State's website, and you can file it electronically. But we need enough information to follow up on that. Now, what we've done since I've come in office is there used to be 2 investigators who sat in the basement of the Capitol in Charleston to run the entire state, investigations throughout the entire state. So you can imagine if something happened here in the Panhandle, what it would take to physically get them here to start an investigation, learn the people, the issues, and so forth. I've moved away from that model and gone to contracting with officers or people, investigators with police backgrounds, investigative backgrounds throughout the state. And so on a moment's notice, we can already have one in the Eastern Panhandle. He typically, he knows the police officers, he knows the people, he knows where the crime areas are, he knows those sorts of issues. So he's not starting from ground zero. He's already here and knows the people. And you can get into an investigation much quicker. And we're doing that throughout the state. We have about 8 right now. So our response time, it's just like our field reps. Response time is much quicker, and they start from a higher level of knowledge when they start the investigation.
We were talking this morning with Secretary of State Mac Warner. Clerks are also seeing an increase in the number of voters registering. I think nearly 26,000 since you've taken office, new to the democratic process. When you talk about an ounce of prevention, is there any new procedure in place when somebody does register to vote that makes sure that there's better track kept of them, or is it still just best practices and we watch for it on election day and at the end after the election is completed?
Well, it's best practices, and this is the clerk's responsibility. The clerks are the chief elections officer for their counties, and so they know the people, they know the locale, and they're in the best position to make sure that things are run properly.
One of the nicest parts is when you do come in and they ask for your voter registration card, they call you by your first name. It's like, if they know your face, it's but that's true. One of the advantages we have in West Virginia is that we do have close-knit communities, so it's not uncommon for the person who's volunteering at the polls to know most of the people in that district by face. So that is an added layer of protection. You can't go on that, necessarily legally, but it certainly is an opportunity for someone to say, "You're not Mac Warner."
Right, exactly.
I'm interested too in this trend that we've seen towards people signing up as independents. I don't know what kind of numbers we have, but I had heard anecdotally, at least, that we're seeing a lot of the long-time Democrats in this state either re-register as Republican or independent. Is that something that you keep track of in the Secretary of State's office? And if so, what's the benefit of knowing who's with what party?
It could be determined. We haven't actually run that number. I can't spout off numbers to you. I can tell you from this clerks conference, I was talking with one clerk in particular who made that observation to me, that I don't think that we're seeing too many people change from one party, major party, to the other major party. I don't think you have too many Democrats changing to Republicans like our governor did. But they are changing from Democrat to independent, is what the clerk observed to me. And I think that's what my gut tells me is happening in many places around the state.
I can say from my own perspective, I'm an independent, and the two things it gives me is the open primary process where I can choose to vote in whichever primary I think best represents me. I also don't feel like either major party really encapsulates my values 100%. So to affiliate with one or the other, and I don't know if that's something that, millennials or whatever, who knows what millennials want anymore. But it seems like having that sort of flexibility or identity is something that is attracting folks for one reason or another.
And that's exactly what the clerk mentioned to me, was that ability to choose between the two parties.
Right now we're looking at Washington, D.C., the capital. Mac Warner, Secretary of State here in the great state of West Virginia, in studio with us, fresh off a visit from D.C. Also with us this morning, Darrell Shull and Dave Tackett, who is the Chief Information Officer for the Secretary of State's office. So you were one of only 4 Secretary of States from across the country who were invited to Washington for a meeting that was hosted by Facebook and Harvard on defending digital democracy. Can you talk about how you spent the last few days in the nation's capital?
Yes, it was an exciting event, and it was focused around a tabletop exercise. And this is, from the military perspective, a simulation that takes you as close as you can to an actual, in the military, combat situation, or in this situation, an election. But it's done on a very condensed timeline. And so they actually had a shot clock running, and every minute. Every minute represented a week in the 6 months leading up to the election. So you had to pre-plan, when did you test your machines for accuracy, and when did you put out your information about early voting and all these sorts of things. So you had to be planning that. And these decisions had to be made quick because every minute another week was going by. And then on election day, every minute represented hours, And so in a 30-minute time period, we ran from 5 o'clock in the morning when poll workers start showing up until 10:30 or 11 o'clock at night when the results are announced and so forth. So you can imagine all the issues that came up at the same time. They're throwing in, interjecting issues, problems, protests, machines going down, news reports coming in, fake news, and that sort of thing. So it put us under, and it was a mix of, you had the 4 elected officials, but you also had Google, Facebook, you had Democracy Works, you had a lot of different players involved in this. We had people. The exciting part about this was the cast of characters there. We had the chief information officer who had been responsible at NSA. Okay, you don't get any more into the cyber world than that. The people who ran the simulation were people who had had 10 years of CIA experience. You had special operations, Delta Force type people who were now students at Harvard, and they were running the simulation. The fellow himself that ran this, that organized it, was the deputy assistant to the Secretary of Defense. So you really we had the best people in the room from across the United States, and so I felt extremely privileged to be a part of that. But they also felt privileged to have secretaries of states in there who were actually running elections, because that's what it was all about. But people from the NSA, I remember the one woman, she said, I knew nothing about elections. I never had the reason to look into that. So I was learning from her in the cyber world. She was learning from me in the elections world. And that was the benefit of this program.
And this was a bipartisan effort, correct?
Absolutely. They had the former campaign manager for Hillary Clinton and the former campaign manager for Mitt Romney. So when you have those two people in the same room working towards the same objective, you had a true bipartisan approach. And then I mentioned again, Google and Facebook were both represented there. So you had the best from private industry. And the word that they said is that they are highly competitive. The two companies looking for each other's, trying to capture the market. But when it comes to security, we're all on the same team. And that's the same thing we have in the elections world. We don't care if it's Republican, Democrat, which campaign. We are all interested in preventing hacks, as we saw in these presidential elections.
Well, and I want to talk about the hacks because we've seen a lot of news since January and even before about hacks, influence, interference. Depending on your adjective or your verb or your noun, it can make things sound very different. My understanding of the Russian influence in our latest election has more to do with Google and Facebook than it does secretaries of state, in that Google and Facebook are, people will post stuff there and then it goes viral and it turns out to be bad information, what was eventually dubbed fake news. Maybe there's some hacking of emails, but the integrity of our election system has not been in question to my knowledge of this. Is that correct?
Especially in West Virginia, no. And what elevates this discussion to where we are now, and part of the reason that the Hillary and the Mitt, the former campaign directors, they were actually directly affected by a nation state or a bad actor that actually compromised their emails. What sort of elevated them to look at this, and that's why across the country and all over the election space, cyber is starting to become something that they talk about. And
Facebook has been pulled into this now as well. Okay, they've discovered that $100,000 worth of advertisement was bought on Facebook from the Russians, and so whether Facebook wanted to or not, they are in the middle of this. So that's why you have all these people who have been hacked or have been used by Russians, as you said, in a psyops type operation. We all, as a nation, to keep confidence in our democratic process, ahead of the curve of these, either it's not just even attacks, but it's the psyops operation of planning false news and that sort of things. And what they're out to do is to discredit or have people lose confidence in the electoral process. And so it's important for all of us, especially secretaries of state, to get the message out. Not one vote was changed, okay? As you mentioned, it's not necessarily changing a vote, but if they can throw enough wrenches into the machinery to cause people to lose that confidence, then they have undermined the foundation of our country, and that's the democratic process.
Right. Either disengage and stop participating, or just say, question any of the results. And we saw a lot of this, they talk about this effort to discredit the president. Donald Trump was lawfully and by every measure legally elected president of the United States. He is our president. Whether folks like it or not, that's, a different issue. But the process worked the way it's supposed to. Outside influences are what are attacking, as you say, the process, not the man. At least as I see it, the media can do what they want with the information, but really that's the end game, I think.
Right. And our press has a tendency, whether to sell papers or to capture the attention, is to run with the most dramatic headline or whatever. Somebody made an analogy in the sports arena that if you put the roster up on a scoreboard at a baseball game, if somebody gets there and hacks and changes the names, It doesn't affect the outcome of the game. You still know who the next batter is supposed to be up, regardless of what the scoreboard said. And that's what they're doing. The Russians are messing with our scoreboard.
Secretary of State Mac Warner, Dave, Darrell, thank you all so much for being in. Look forward to welcoming you home again, probably November 9th, I guess we'll be back at the for the ribbon cutting.
Thank you for having us.
WEPM Martinsburg.